Hey everybody, it's good to see you again. I hope you had an incredible Christmas and holiday season. Hope there were a couple days in there that you were so relaxed that you absolutely forgot what day of the month, what day of the week it was, and you just got to enjoy spending some time with family and friends. So I'm really excited. So I've been trying to figure out what would be a good use of our time and what would be some good things to talk about that would be helpful to faith. And really feel like the thing that the Lord's led me to do is to talk about the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew 5 through 7 in its most complete form. And the reason for that is the Sermon on the Mount really is kind of the beginning of Christianity. It's Jesus kind of setting things up. So I don't know what your experience in life has been, but I've been a part of all kinds of different startups in a lot of different ways. I've got to plant a church before. I've got to help other people plant a church. I've helped people who were kind of starting up their business. In one case, I got to work with a Fortune 500 company, helping them start a new business that was doing finances for families, but really doing it from a faith perspective. And so I've got to be a part of all these startups. And what's incredible about startups is no matter what kind it is, church, small business, big business, a sports team, it really always focuses on the same thing. You have to figure out who you are, who you're going to be, what your values are, the things that you are going to do and aren't going to do, who your target audience is going to be, who should feel welcome among you, and really who should kind of not feel welcome among you. That's what you do at a startup, right? When you're starting a church. Who are we going to be? How are we going to be distinct? What are we going to do that we feel like God's called us to do? What we're non-negotiable. We're not going to move off of these. A business is the same way. As I'm starting a business up right now, I'm going through, okay, who's your target going to be? Because everybody's not a target, right? Like everybody means nobody. And what are you going to do? And what's going to be your distinctives? And what's really cool about the Sermon on the Mount is it's Jesus at the beginning of his startup. It's Jesus at the beginning of his movement. And he's saying, this is what my movement is going to be about. He's not saying, well, I think, or, hey, if you're okay with it. He's saying, this is who we are. I can remember when we were planting the Oasis, we knew that we needed to do that. We needed to know what our values and our non-negotiables were. And so we figured them out. They were community, they were serving. It was trusting in the Word of God and trusting other people. It was giving generously, and we held that so closely that we would tell people, if you're not on board with this, it would be good for you to go ahead and move on. To especially Christians find another church, because we're going. This is what Jesus called us to, and we don't want to be distracted in any way from that. And in a very real way, that's what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount. He's not saying, hey, what do you guys think? What should the kingdom look like? He's saying, as the person that's been tasked by God to start this movement, to start the church, to help people meet my Father again, he said, here's what will be true of you. And so when you get into the Sermon on the Mount, it's really cool because you can see Jesus's expectation for every single person who will ever say yes. It reminds me a little bit, to be very honest, what he's doing in the Sermon on the Mount of boot camp. When you go to boot camp, at least when I did 25, 30 years ago now, which seems crazy, they start out by rebuilding you. You go there, right? Like in my case, I got down to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and we didn't get a shower for 2 or 3 days, and so our hair is a mess, and we're in the same pair of clothes for 3 days, so we smell horrible. They called us rainbows because we had all kinds of different colors. We weren't unified. But then when boot camp begins in earnest, oh man, they take you in, they shave everybody, all the guys bald. The ladies, they cut their hair and make them put them up in a certain way. They remove all individualization. I mean, 100%, right? To where you lose everything, all your personal items. And you go into this room where they strip you down and they give you uniform everything, uniform socks, uniform underwear, t-shirts. I mean, there's no boxer brief question. It's here's what you're wearing, and everyone's wearing the same thing. And you walk out of that room and you are unified. The only thing distinct about you in that moment is your last name. Now, over time, they rebuild you. And then when they send you into the service, at least their mindset is, hey, listen, you are an individual. You don't have to conform to the likeness of everybody else around you, but you do have to be committed and conform to the mission. You do have to do it the way that the military says to do it. And so they give you back your freedoms as long as you're willing to surrender your freedoms for the sake of something greater. And when I think about the Sermon on the Mount, I really see Jesus doing that. He's calling us to conformity around what matters to him and yet keeping our distinct natures as well. He's not saying become a robot. Everyone's got to look the same, be the same. God created diversity on purpose. But he is saying within the diversity, here's what you must do. Here's what you must think. Here's what you must believe. And this carries all throughout the rest of the New Testament as well. There's a passage in Romans chapter 12 that's really cool where he says this. I'm going to read it to you real quick. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, because of what God's done, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. I don't know how often we think about pleasing God, but he says, think about pleasing God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He says, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. See, there's this idea that when we come to Christ and we say yes to him, we're agreeing to kind of go through a boot camp. And the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus saying, here is what we value, here's what we think, here's what we feel, here's how we live out our lives. And so in the Romans passage, it's really cool because he says you have to change the way that you think. You can't accept Jesus and live the way he expects you to live with the same mind you had when you came in. Nancy and I were up in the mountains visiting a church this past week in a place called Woodland Park, and they had their elders up in a panel, and they were talking about the verse that they were going to be using for this year. It happened to be Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And one of the elders explained really cool. He said, it starts out, set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above. And he goes on to talk about that a little bit. And the guy used the analogy of an alarm clock. And this is what he said. He said, if you don't set it, you will oversleep. He said, but just because you set it doesn't mean anything. Because if you hit snooze when it goes off, then what was the point of having the alarm clock in the first place? And he took that and he made an analogy back to Christianity. And he said, listen, we have to set our hearts, set our passions, set like what we want according to the will of Jesus. And we have to set our minds on that as well and go, okay, so how am I going to carry that out? And so it's emotion and action tied together. So when you get to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling us, this is how you will act and this is how you will feel. What's really interesting is there's another place in Hebrews chapter 12, 11 and 12, and the guy's talking about these people of great faith. And he makes this really interesting statement. He says, if you don't change the way that you think, you'll begin to think about going back to what you used to do. Right? Like he uses the Israel-Egypt analogy, and he says when Israel left Egypt, because their hearts and minds didn't change on the journey, they started wanting to go back to Egypt, even though they were in slavery in Egypt. And I think, how many times do we do that where we go, hey, I haven't changed the way that I think about a certain thing. I haven't changed the way that I feel about a thing. I've not changed my actions. And so then when Jesus calls us to something, it seems too big, and we just go, I would rather go back to the life that I had that was bondage. And so the Sermon on the Mount that we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks and couple months really is this idea of Jesus saying, this is what it looks like to be a citizen of heaven. If you're going to escape the corruption of the world, this is what it's going to look like. And so I've got a couple different things we're going to talk about. I'm going to scroll real quick so I can make sure to get these different ideas. We're going to talk about things like this, that Jesus says that we have to believe God over our circumstances. I think some of us go, I know that's what we're supposed to believe. No, Jesus didn't say that's what you're supposed to believe. Jesus said if you're a follower of Christ, that's what you will believe. And there's a distinction, because what we're supposed to do, sometimes we feel okay not doing, but what we will do is what we will do. Here's another one that will affect and impact the culture around us in a positive way. Like he talks about, and we'll talk about this idea of salt and preservation and healing. And your job is not to make it to heaven. Your job is to make it to heaven as you get as many more people healed as you can. Jesus used an analogy in the Sermon on the Mount about light. And he says, we're going to give light to people. We're going to give hope to people. We're going to show people the way home. And so to be a Christian is to do that, not to select, I think I will or I think I won't, but boot camp. What Jesus says, hey, here's the standard. The standard is we will be salt, we will be light. There's all kinds of other stuff in there we're going to cover too, like, that the Old Testament matters. As a follower of Jesus, you're going to care about what happened before Jesus, because it all tells us the story, the reason for Jesus. It gives us all kinds of illustrations and analogies. There's a whole section in there we'll cover where it says, you've heard that it was said this, but I tell you the truth. And it's the idea that Christians go further. We go further than a normal human would. So he'll use things like forgiveness. and go, yeah, we don't forgive like the world forgives. Our forgiveness doesn't make sense to non-Christian people. Our view of anger doesn't make sense. The world would say, well, you should be angry right now. You should be reacting right now. You have a right to. And we were to reject all that and say, because of Jesus, even though that would be natural, we believe differently, we act differently, we have different passions, we have different views. We'll talk about things like generosity. And the generosity is not an optional characteristic inside of Christianity. Christians give. We give everything we have, and everything means something. It means we give financially, faithfully. It means we give above what we're required. It means we're generous. There's a whole section Jesus is going to talk about. To be a Christian is to care more about the praise of God than we do the praise of men. And this is a theme throughout the whole Bible, by the way, and especially in the New Testament, that to follow God, to honor God, to please God, we have to quit caring so much about what everybody else thinks while we still care about everybody else. And we have to care more about what God thinks. And so we're not going to do what we do to make other people happy. We're going to do it in view of who God is. And there's going to be all kinds of other things. We're going to talk about how to pray and why we pray. And we'll touch on fasting. We're going to talk about things like judgment and how, you do need to judge yourself. And there are times that you need to speak judgment over another person in a very loving way. But we don't get to go around judging everybody else and then asking for grace ourselves. So talk about that tension between judgment and grace, about how some people are going to say they follow Jesus, and then the day he sees them, he's not going to recognize them, and he's going to tell them so. And we don't ever want that to be any of us or any of the people around us. We want to help them make a distinction, choose yes or choose no, but don't be deceived. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, is just going through the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, and looking at those things that Jesus said, this is what it means to be a citizen of heaven. My hope for you is that in the midst of that you begin to change. Because for us to believe the truth without it changing us is really pointless. There are a lot of people who are in churches today who believe everything they ought to believe, but not to the degree that it changes who they are. And therefore they will be the people who stand before Jesus and he says, no, I know all the stuff you did, but I didn't know you. We didn't have relationship. You didn't renew and renovate your mind. You're still thinking like you always thought. You're still behaving like you've always behaved. Your behavior makes sense to the world instead of confusing them. And the goal is to go to boot camp. The goal is to say, okay, Jesus, you know what? Show me what it means to follow you and to be changed by that to such a degree that we're no longer what we once were. So that's where we're going. I hope you'll absolutely enjoy it. Stick around for a couple minutes and I'll give you some questions that you can ask as you share this with other people. So let me go to those real quick. Here's the first one is, have you ever been a part of something, a startup, something new, a new team, a new business, a new church? And if so, what did you have to do at the beginning to ensure you ended up where you wanted to? Right? That question is like, what were the things that you had to decide upon? What were the things you had to do? And what did it cost you? Like when you said, no, this, we're going to be a church that is relational. What did that cost you? Because in some ways, maybe it cost you a crowd. Because you said, no, we're going to get together. And they went, yeah, I'm not interested in getting together. Okay, well, then go ahead and beat feet. Or maybe for you, it was, we're going to rely on the word of God. Someone came in and said, well, that makes me uncomfortable because I don't like what Jesus said there. And you go, well, I'm sorry. It's going to cost us relationship because I stand where Jesus stands. Like, what did it cost you? The second one that I've got for you is, where do you cling too tightly to your individuality? Where do you hang on, right? When you think of that boot camp analogy, you're going there and they're gonna shave your head and give you different clothes and take all your personal items away, and it's gonna be you and a bunch of other people in a sea of green. Like, where do you grieve letting go of something that's yours? I remember like when they shaved my head, one of my griefs was my hair, and not that there's a ton of it, but I remember just rubbing my head for like 2 weeks, like my hair, it's all gone. But so like in life, when Jesus calls you and you say yes, what's a piece of individuality you have trouble giving up? I don't like giving up my time. I don't like giving up my money. I don't like giving up who I am. I don't like talking about my past. I don't like talking about where Jesus has had to rescue me. I don't like serving. I don't like messing around with other people. Like, where does your individuality come too high where it gets in the way of your calling? So number 3, what's something you've not wanted to change, but you have because of Jesus? right? Like it's not always negative. Sometimes there's that positive, like what's something you went, yeah, I didn't want to give this up, but in view of who Christ is, in view of God's mercy, man, I gave this up. It's because of my great love for him. Maybe you gave up a dream. Maybe you gave up a lifestyle that you really liked. I think sometimes when we talk about sin, we act like, well, sin was horrible. Like sin's impact's horrible, but sin is fun in the moment, or we wouldn't do it. And so, some of us, we have to have given up things, or maybe, I had to give up some of my selfishness. I had to care about other people. I think anyone that goes into leadership, you have to give up a certain amount of what you have a right to for the sake of other people. So that's the third one. The fourth one is in Romans 12, and check out Romans 12, 1 and 2. Paul calls us to renew or renovate our minds. And I guess my question would be, what are you doing right now to change the way that you think? If Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is saying you can't think like you used to think, you got to think differently, and you need to feel differently. I know that's a hard one for us because we think we have no control over our emotions, although I do think we do. It's what we feed, by the way. But when you go into Romans chapter 12 and it says, renovate your mind, going back to the sermon that we heard, set your mind on things above, set your heart on things above. Where are you setting an alarm clock in your life? And what's that been like? Where have you said, hey, I will not fill in the blank? One of the things for the new year for me that's been kind of cool is I realized that I was spending too much time on my phone. And for me, what would happen is I would lay in bed right before I went to bed or right when I got up, and I would grab my phone first thing and I would check messages. But then after messages, I would check Facebook, and then I would check LinkedIn, and then I would check the news, and then, I'd go back to Facebook, and then I would see, a turtle chasing a dog with a fishing pole. And so I'd watch that video, and, pretty soon I'm like an hour into watching these stupid videos and reels. And I realized, hey, that's not good for me. It's not good for my family. It's not good for my business. And so I set an alarm, and this is what I did. I went, hey, I'm not going to touch my phone while I'm on my bed. So that was a big one for me. And for me, it was, I'm not going to watch any more of these silly videos because they just take me, an hour away from anything that I want to do. Now, that's what I did to set. That doesn't mean anything if the next time my phone dings and I'm in bed, I go, well, just this time. And so what I'm doing is I set an alarm and I'm not hitting snooze. As long as my feet, my butt are on that bed, I don't touch my phone. And when my feet hit the ground and I'm standing, because then I'm in motion, I'll grab my phone and check a couple things. And so just that question, right? Like, what are you doing to renovate your mind? Where are you setting an alarm, and how are you not hitting the snooze? And then the last question, I would tell you to go to Hebrews chapter 11. You can read the whole section there, but 15 specifically. And it says that we don't change our minds, that we'll have a longing to go back to what we left. And I would just ask you to look through your life right now and go, where am I kind of longing to go back? Where am I living like I haven't been changed? Where do I wish it was different than it is? And how is that dragging me away maybe from what God wants me to do? And so my hope is that these questions that are at the end, that you're not just using them yourself. I think that would be great, but that you're using them with somebody else. You're having a conversation with a neighbor, a friend, a spouse, maybe your son or your daughter. You're going, hey, we're going to go through this together. I'd love it if you'd send me any feedback you've got. Hey, Mike, if we could talk about this, or, that would be great. You can give me feedback on, hey, I hate the backdrop. Don't do the closet doors again. Or, one of my buddies was like, hey, man, just make better eye contact. That's awesome, right? Like, I need to hear that stuff because I want to make sure this is effective at showing you I love you and leading you to the things that Jesus has for you. So I absolutely love you. Hope you have a great week. Please comment so that I know that you're paying attention, and tell me how you're doing. I sure miss your faces. God bless, and I love you.